You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
In that same summer of 1934, Roosevelt had to deal with another major strike. And that was the strike of Teamsters in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, the Teamsters were supported by other working people. And soon nothing was moving in the city except milk, ice, and coal trucks given exemption by the strikers. Farmers drove their products into town and sold them directly to the people in the city. The police attacked, the two strikers were killed, and 50,000 people attended the mass funeral. There was an enormous protest meeting and a march on City Hall. And after a month, the employers gave in to the Teamsters' demands. But let's visit a documentary on the shutdown of Minneapolis.
Don't have jobs. They can't get unemployment benefits or other aid because this was before those government programs were created. Their attempts to organize have been met by police clubs. Hungry for work, they could be hired to replace workers who are on strike. The leaders of Local 574 know this and reach out to these workers, inviting them to form their own section of the union. Encouraged by the solidarity exhibited by the truckers, the unemployed workers sign up to serve as pickets instead of strikebreakers. The Teamsters in Minneapolis are inspired by the courage of workers in other cities who are also standing up for fairness and the right to join unions. In Toledo, Ohio, thousands of workers at an auto parts factory, half of them women, go out on strike with the full support of unemployed people in their community. In San Francisco, people fill the streets and shipping is stopped at every port on the West Coast when longshoremen go on strike to have a voice in the workplace. By mid-May, with their plans carefully mapped out, the now 6,000 members of Local 574 in Minneapolis vote to shut down the city. They demand better wages and union recognition. They also tell the employers that the union must include not only drivers, but all of the men and women working at the warehouses. The union uses a brilliant but risky tactic called the cruising picket line. Carloads of strikers cruise the downtown area looking for trucks that might be trying to move cargo in violation of the strike. When they spot one, the picketers stand in front of the truck with their signs. The tactic works well, and for several days, the truck traffic is nearly halted. This kind of operation requires a lot of support. Women work 12-hour shifts to feed thousands of strikers. Sympathetic small business people provide food for the strike kitchen.
Some of the milk companies sent in milk and gave us tickets so pickets could take milk home for their children.
Secretaries who support the strike listen in on their employers and give the union information regarding anti-strike plans. The workers are winning, but the employers have not given up.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
On May 21, 1934, strikers, police, and special deputies hired by the Citizens Alliance confront each other in hand-to-hand combat in the city's Central Market District. The conflict spills over into the next day when a local radio station broadcasts live from the site.
And the cops showed us how to swing clubs, and then the day before, and we learned fast over. We beat them back, and so they shut the gates finally.
Police and Citizens Alliance deputies flee the clubs of the pickets who soon control the streets. Injured police, deputies, and strikers lie bleeding on the cobblestones. 2 Citizens Alliance deputies die from the blows they receive. One of them, a prominent Minneapolis businessman. Desperate to put an end to the violence, Governor Floyd B. Olson urges the union and the Citizens Alliance to meet. After 3 days, an agreement is reached. The strikers will be reinstated to their jobs, and the employers agree to grant union recognition to a broad range of workers in the trucking industry. But the battle for Minneapolis, which now appears settled, has really only just begun. Soon, it becomes clear that the employers are not sticking to their side of the deal. The workers vote to strike again in mid-July. The union's newspaper, The Organizer, becomes the first daily paper ever published by a striking union. A strike committee of 100 is elected to represent the many different kinds of workers in the industry. They meet every morning and lay out their plans for the day. Many other unions come out in support of the strike. A special farmers market is set up so that small farmers can sell their food directly to the public, thus avoiding hardship from the strike.
We were fortunate to be in a state where there was an active farm holiday association. The farmers helped us tremendously. And they used to bring in food and supplies and milk in every way. And farmers that understand what it's all about realize that they're workers too, except they ain't got no 8 to 5 day. They start in the morning and they quit at night, and it's 7 days a week. But the farmers around the adjacent area to the Twin Cities were tremendous in their support and help in the 34 strike.
Pickets fan out from new headquarters in the heart of downtown. They keep the streets nearly free of truck movement. The mayor of Minneapolis urges Governor Olson to mobilize the National Guard in case of new outbreaks of violence. The Minneapolis police chief orders his forces to begin moving goods. On July 20th, Henry Ness is on picket duty for the union. He is riding on the back of a pickup with a dozen other strikers when a truck carrying merchandise pulls out from a warehouse near the market. The pickup in which Ness is riding moves quickly to intercept the truck. Standing by, a line of police are ready with their shotguns.
We heard the shooting. It was in the middle of the block. The truck would have tried to intercept the truck, I'm sure. That was the intent. But nobody got out of the truck, and the pictures will show police started to open fire on them. Harry and I and Ben Koski, and I remember Ben because we were all three injured, come out of that alley, and we ran into a policeman who was down on one knee, and he had a Sub-Thompson machine riot gun. And just as we come around the corner, he fired. And he knocked Harry DeBoer's leg. We didn't know how bad, but Harry fell down. Ben Koski's hand was right next to Harry's leg, and he pretty near severed it. And I got the balance of the charge, lacerations in the stomach area, and I got some cracked ribs out of it. I thought I was killed because I was bleeding, but it was just surface wounds, it turned out to be. We got Harry, got him up to the strike headquarters, we got Koski there, and everyone went to different hospitals.
All right, fascinating story again. The 1934 Minneapolis Shutdown. We need to appreciate, students, what's going on here. Remember back the different generation prior to World War I, we saw the socialist organizing influencing populist reform or progressive reform. Again, World War I pulled the rug from the socialists by incarcerating them, and it quieted progressive reform. So that the 1920s was a conservative era that led to this economic meltdown. And now we see socialist organizing, and it's influencing progressive reform. As we can see by these experiences, remember, conservatives in this country, anytime Americans attempt to organize for their rights, conservatives will cry out communism, will cry out socialist agitation. They need to be deported. But you can take a look at these peoples who are just normal like you and me. I don't think that they're communist. I don't think that they're socialist. I think that they're human beings, people like you and me participating in movements seeking justice and economic equality. So get to know what the Red Scare is all about. Do not be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. Now, as we can see, Roosevelt and his administration, his advisors, and the businessmen who supported Roosevelt understood that measures had to be taken quickly to give jobs, provide relief, and regulate labor disputes. But it wasn't all of a sudden just because they thought that they are going to protect or they're going to think about the immigrant or the immigrant's children. The National Labor Relations Act, or what is known as the Wagner Act, after its sponsor, New York Senator Robert F. Wagner, is a 1935 United States federal law that limits the means with which employers may react to workers in the private sector who create labor unions, who are also known as trade unions. Now, this act is very important because the idea is to eliminate the violence, as we see in the 1934 strikes. And the idea is to force owners to engage in collective bargaining and to take part in strikes and other forms of concerted activity by the workers in support of their demands. President Roosevelt signed the legislation and law on July 5th, 1935. And this law defined and prohibited 5 unfair labor practices. And these prohibitions still exist, while others have been added under labor legislation or under later legislation. Now, the original employer unfair labor practices consisted of interfering with, restraining, or coercing employees in their rights under Section 7. And these rights include freedom of association, mutual aid or protection, self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively for wages and working conditions through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other protected concerted activities with or without a union. So the Wagner Act is very important. It prohibits another practices from dominating or interfering with the formation or administration of any labor organization. It prohibits discriminating against employees to encourage or discourage acts of support for a labor organization. It prohibits discriminating against employees who falsify charges or testify. And it prohibits refusing to bargain collectively with the representatives of employers, employees. So big business obviously thought it was too helpful to labor, and they opposed it. Roosevelt was cool to it, but as we have seen by these labor outbursts, it suggested the need for legislative action. So again, we can see how socialist organizing influenced progressive reform. The previous immigrant generation, now the children of immigrants and the immigrants themselves, are going to ask the federal government, please support us. So in 1934 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of workers that were left out of the tightly controlled exclusive unions of the trades, known as the American Federation of Labor, they began organizing in the new mass production industries of auto, rubber, and the packing houses. And this new union is going to be a committee first. The AFL could no longer ignore them, and in 1935, the American Federation of Labor, there was a convention that the conservative leadership was challenged by David Dubinsky of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, by John Lewis of the United Mine Workers, and Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. And a resolution to organize the mass of industrial workers was defeated, and these 3 walked out and formed what will be known as the Committee for Industrial Organizations. It became known as the CIO, but at first it was just a committee. And the committee was set up to organize workers outside of craft lines. By industry, all workers in a plant belonged to one union. So this committee was very important. It began to address what immigrants and children of immigrants had been asking for in terms of a living wage. Now, as Howard Zinn describes in his epic volume of A People's History of the United States, it was the rank-and-file strikes and insurgencies that pushed the union leadership of the AFL and the CIO into action, because a new kind of tactic began among the rubber workers in Akron, Ohio in the early 30s. It became known as the sit-down strike in Akron, Ohio. Now the workers, these were the children of immigrants' parents, they were immigrants themselves. What they did was they stayed inside the plant instead of walking out. And this had clear advantages. They were directly blocking the use of strikebreakers. They did not have to act through union officials, but were in direct control of the situation themselves. They did not have to walk outside in the cold rain, but had shelter. They were not isolated as in their work or in the picket line. There were thousands under one roof. They were free to talk to one another to form a community of struggle. And in early 1936, at the Firestone rubber plant in Akron, Ohio, makers of truck tires, their wages already too low to pay for food and rent, were faced with a wage cut. And when several union men were fired, others began to stop work to sit down on the job. Workers then at Goodyear followed suit. And this idea spread throughout 1936. And in December of 1936, the longest and the most famous sit-down strike of all began at Fisher Body Plant Number 1 in Flint, Michigan. It became known as the Flint's sit-down strike. Let's go to a documentary and find out what happened at the sit-down strike.
These were days when history changed its course. The sit-down strikes began on December 30th. They began with the attempt of GM to move the dies at Fisher Number 1 to Grand Rapids and elsewhere.
They have no idea what it was like to have to work along a line in the shop. It was hard work.
And then you didn't get no overtime. And if you worked it over, it was just your straight regular time. Of course, the women weren't allowed to work any overtime, but the men, they could work overtime, but wouldn't get no extra pay for it.
It was hot in the summer, cold in the winter. You couldn't always take time off if you needed to go to the bathroom. And I remember in 1936, before the strike, it was very, very hot. And down in the Chevrolet, there were people who were dropping over because of the heat. And the other workers were told, just step over them until we can get them out of the way. They didn't slow down the line. They didn't stop it. And they just dragged people away. It was terrible. And I think that's one thing that really helped bring on the strike.
On January the 4th, the union submitted a complete list of grievances. We asked for a national General Motors agreement, for day rates and the abolition of the hated piecework system, for seniority, for recognition of the union, for control of speed-up, for grievance procedures, for the reinstatement of all the men who had been fired for union activity, and for a 30-hour week. GM said no to everything. Widely separated workers, workers who didn't know each other, workers who didn't know each other's names, men who had been divided, weak and oppressed, came together in union and in solidarity. The union spokesman was John L. Lewis. Reporters from all over the world converged on Flint. Flint, the General Motors factories where the workers were sitting in, had become a stage which the workers of the world, wherever they were watching intently. Extra editions of papers came out on Flint developments in Paris, in Rome, in London, Calcutta, Buenos Aires.
Well, the men stayed, but the women had to go out. We couldn't stay.
I remember my dad calling home a few weeks into the strike and saying to my mother, Ida, we're having trouble keeping some of these young fellows in here. They're threatening, their wives are threatening to divorce them, or they want them home, and the guys want to get home naturally. And she said, Jay Green, if you come out, I will divorce you.
I know there's one guy that had 5 kids, and he got so nervous he'd pass out because he had 5 kids and he didn't know he was going to get a job or not, get a job back.
It was a bitter winter in January. Flint was the Valley Forge of the people who work in the plants. These were times when the summer soldiers fell away and the winter soldiers stood up in a terrible trial. Armchair generals and colonels were demanding that the National Guardsmen go into those plants and shoot the sit-downers out. But for once, the National Guard truly maintained law and order. The strikers were disciplined, but the Flint City government was the General Motors government after all, and General Motors insisted, so the police tried to evict the sit-downers. This is not vandalism you see there. They are breaking these windows to let the air in and to let the tear gas out. The attempt to end the sit-down strike in tear gas and blood, as if it were a kind of 13th century peasants' revolt, failed. There were casualties.
We didn't know what was going to happen. And then, of course, when the National Guard was called out, we were scared to death that they were going to maybe shoot down the workers, the strikers. But it didn't. We had a good governor, and he sent the National Guard in to protect them.
We will work our way out of this strike peacefully and without injustice to anyone. And I am confident that after it's all over with, there will be a better understanding between employer and employee. And better still, I hope that conditions will be improved under which men and women labor and live.
The sit-down strikes reached their climax at the beginning of February. Governor Murphy had been in office just 1 month. General Motors had tried everything, spies and intimidation. GM had taken its case to court before a judge who was a GM stockholder. The corporation had applied pressure on Governor Murphy. It had tried evicting the strikers by force. But not for a moment did the discipline of the strikers waver. Their wives and their children came to the factory windows. The troops, there to maintain order, not to shoot strikers, bivouacked in the streets.
The strike came to an end on February the 11th, 1937. Governor Murphy announced the settlement terms. For a period of 6 months, General Motors would not, without the governor's permission, deal with any employee spokesman except the UAW and the 17 plants that had been struck. In the other plants, the union would be dealt with as representatives for its own members. No discrimination against union people. All strikers would be rehired. Union members could talk about the union during lunch and rest periods. All court proceedings against the union and its members to end. The company would begin to negotiate with the union in good faith. It was a magnificent and historic victory.
Well, it made a company give us a better feeling. And for black people, we got jobs that we didn't get before, because most of the time we were just sweeping the floor. But after that, we all went on machines and everything.
People need a union. That's the main thing, because you can't survive too long without a union and really live a decent life. Kids just don't have any idea what it was like. But I'm afraid someday they're going to find out.
The people will have a union, hang on to it, because you can't be without one. If you don't, you get somebody there whipping you, make you work there, and no representation on how it is. No representation, they take advantage of you.
General Motors workers in Flint get the news of the settlement, and the celebration is spontaneous. The flag tells you how the people feel. They have just won back one of their constitutional rights. Home is the sit-down. After the long, patient struggle in the factory, the men go home. What these people are celebrating deep into the night is the end of an impossible and unbearable subjection. Unions have brought wage earners so much security and freedom and dignity that it isn't easy even to recall the terrible oppression that came to an end with the winning of the sit-down strike.
Well, it made a middle class. We could have decent food. We could live in a decent place. We could wear decent clothes. We could relax, which we just couldn't before. We were always on edge, it seemed, that if you're hungry sometimes, that's not good. And I remember being hungry sometimes. People were able to buy homes, hold their heads high, have self-respect, which we didn't always have before.
Again, very important for this generation. What she said about self-respect, about having a home for the first time, about being relaxed and not being oppressed. And again, these are the children of immigrants and immigrants themselves who went out to make sure that social justice and economic equality could be had in the United States. So get to know the Red Scare, students. Don't be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. And again, conservatives in this country do not like it when there is socialist agitation, because after all, the idea is about human rights and immigrant rights. Now, the sit-downs were especially dangerous to the system because they were not controlled by regular union leadership.